Hello everybody, welcome to TCOM 408 Online. This is video number 7. I'm Dr. Mike Gerhard from the Department of Telecommunications at Ball State. Hello and welcome to class. Hey, in the last videos we talked about ethics in terms of virtue and character and in terms of duties and obligations. Well, in this video we'll look at our final basic ethical perspective, which places the focus on consequence or outcomes in the real world. Consequentialist theories is what we'll talk about today. Sorry, Kant and you other absolutists, outcomes matter according to the consequentialist theory. Now, consequentialism holds that it's the consequences or outcomes of a particular action that should form the basis for any moral judgment about that action. What were the results of the action? From a consequentialist standpoint, a morally right action is one that produces a good outcome, a good consequence for the most people. Another way of looking at consequentialism is the ends justify the means. It's the ends, the outcomes that are important and not how we get there. Now, one good example of an outcome-based theory or a consequentialist theory is a theory known as utilitarianism. It's a wonderful idea. It's a moral theory that says the morality of an action depends on the results, the outcome. Utilitarianism is the idea that the moral worth of an action is solely determined by its contribution to overall utility. That is, its contribution to happiness or pleasure or goodness as summed among all persons. Now, the leading proponent of utilitarianism was a famous philosopher known as John Stuart Mill. And he came up with the principle of utility as a framework for approaching ethics. The principle of utility, it's an ethical perspective that suggests ethical behavior arises from that action which produces the greatest good for the greatest number of people. That's how you remember utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Said John Stuart Mill, an act's righteousness is determined by its contribution to a desirable end, a desirable outcome. Now, the problem with consequentialism is that it's really hard to predict the outcomes or the consequences of our actions. That's just one problem with the theory. Now, here's a closely related approach. It's called situational ethics. And this is the viewpoint that an ethical decision depends upon the situation, upon the context. And so the moral imperative or the absolute duty is not what's important here. Everything depends on the situation. Situational ethics, it's a teleological or outcome-based theory. And that's always concerned with the outcomes or the consequences of the action. If you practice situational ethics, okay, the ends can justify the means. It depends on the situation. Situational ethics. If it weren't for situational ethics, I might not have any ethics at all. How about this as a related term? Cultural relativism. This is the idea that what's good or bad depends upon the culture in which the action is occurring. So the right thing to do in a situation will depend on the culture in which you live and what the cultural norms dictate. Now, do you agree with this? That everything is relative in terms of culture? I happen to believe that there's certain basic human rights that are universal, that transcend culture. The right to an education, the right to free speech, the right to associate peaceably with others. To me, these are all fundamental human rights that should transcend culture. I'm not a big advocate of cultural relativism. Now, If you're talking about, cultural artifacts like food and clothing, oh, fine. Celebrate whatever culturally you want. But in terms of some of these basic human rights, I personally am not willing to compromise. But you have to come to your own truths ultimately on these issues. Here's another interesting theoretical perspective: communitarianism, which asks what's not in my best interest, but what's in the best interest of the community in which I live. Communitarianism emphasizes the need to balance individual rights and interest with that of the community as a whole. It's a balancing act. Communitarians say that our autonomous selves don't exist in isolation. We're shaped by the values and the culture of the communities in which we live, and we have an obligation to those communities. Communitarians assert that when issues are social and political, then community trumps individuals, but doesn't trample them. So communitarianism is really kind of a we first perspective rather than a me first perspective. To me, the people practicing the good safety precautions right now, wearing the mask and the social distancing and following the guidelines, to me, they're communitarianism followers. They're promoting community and others over just self. Anyway, before we wrap this up, I want you to remember that ethics isn't a science. There's no formula we can plug everything into, no algorithm that will come up with the perfect answer for us. None of the ethical theories is perfect. They all have flaws. Okay? The idea, though, is to use this wisdom to think for yourself. Don't let anybody else think for you all the time. Letting others think for you is tantamount to letting yourself become a slave, a puppet to other people's thoughts and desires. Okay? You need to be aware of ethics, your own ethical framework, and what's important to you so you're not manipulated by others. And this is really important in a free and just democracy. Citizens, not the philosophers, not the elites, but the citizens should take responsibility for deciding what's good and what's right. Okay. So let's summarize the basic ethical perspectives that we've talked about. Okay, the focus on the individual, the action, and the outcome. So Aristotle, the golden mean, this is virtue ethics that focus on the actor. Then we've got Immanuel Kant and the categorical or moral imperative, and these are theories that focus on the action and the duties. And then we've got folks like John Stuart Mill and the principle of utility, the greatest good for the greatest number. And those people are focused on the outcome or the consequence of our actions. So these are all valid and useful theoretical perspectives, truly the wisdom of the ages. So to summarize these, we've got the ancient Greek virtue theories that emphasize character development. Aristotle's golden mean, a wonderful principle to help us solve some of our ethical dilemmas. We've got all these duty-based theories that say we have obligations. Some of them might come from God, divine command theory. We've got this wonderful duty obligation called the golden rule. The categorical, the moral imperatives, what are they for yourself and the company for which you might work? Egalitarianism, the notion of equality and fairness. How do we get there? Sometimes by wearing the veil of ignorance. We've talked about the difference between altruism and egoism. I introduced you to an interesting theory, the pluralistic theory of duty, Ross's pluralistic theory of duty, a wonderful set of obligations for us to consider. Then we've got all the consequentialist theories, the outcome-based theories like utilitarianism and situational ethics. Heck, we even talked about cultural relativism and communitarianism. So these are interesting and important notions, and I certainly hope that you can use these ethical viewpoints, this wisdom in your decision making and in these class assignments. Now, two other theories that we need to talk about just briefly, and we'll be elaborating more on these, but the notion of social responsibility ethics and the notion of professional ethics. Social responsibility ethics raises the question, what's in the best interest of society? Not profit, not me, not the company as per se, but what's in the best interest of all of us, the environment and all of us all the stakeholders. And then professional ethics. These are the people who work in an industry. A lot of times they develop guidelines for proper behavior. And the question usually around professional ethics is, what would my colleagues and my peers think of some ethical decision? So we'll be talking more about these professional ethics. These are very important. These are the principles that govern the behavior of a person in a particular group or business environment. One of the earliest examples of this is the famous Hippocratic Oath from ancient Greece, which all medical doctors still adhere to this day. They take an oath to do no harm. Most professionals have codes of ethics, written codes of ethics that the members of the profession are expected to follow. And so we'll be talking about the strengths and weaknesses of these professional codes of ethics as we continue in the course. An example might be the group that represents the billboard industry, the outdoor advertising industry. This is the Out-of-Home Advertising Association of America. And it has a set of principles, or it's written a code of ethics. Now, let's say you did a case study involving some controversial billboard. In that case, you might want to turn to a written code of ethics for advice and for guidance. If we examine the Outdoor Advertising Code of Ethics, you can see it brings up principles like free speech, privacy, protecting children, supporting worthy public causes, and respecting the environment. So perhaps we could turn to a code of ethics to help us make a decision. Okay, another set of ethics involves this notion of social responsibility. What obligations do I have to the greater world around me? Okay, this is the model that helps a company be socially accountable and to behave in ways that are right to itself, to its stakeholders, and to the public. The problem with social responsibility theory is trying to figure out what these responsibilities are. Responsible to whom and for what? But social responsibility theory means that in the normal course of business, a company should operate in ways that enhance society and the environment instead of hurting society and the environment, helping the larger society. Well, that's all I've got for this video. I hope you benefited from it. I encourage you to use these ideas in the upcoming assignments. All right? So continue to take care of yourself and to care about the world around you. And I'll see you again soon. So long.